two carrier strike groups, $40 billion of American naval combat power, nuclear-powered, the most lethal surface vessels ever constructed by any nation in human history. They were in the Eastern Mediterranean for 23 combined weeks. They were put there publicly, deliberately, as the physical expression of American deterrence, the iron signal to every government in the region that escalation beyond a certain threshold would be met with a response that no adversary could survive. Last night, they retreated. Within 90 minutes of the strike beginning, both groups initiated withdrawal procedures. Within 4 hours, they were moving west at maximum sustainable speed without having fired a single weapon, without suffering a single casualty, without receiving a single direct attack. And what I'm going to tell you in the next several minutes is why that retreat is not the story. The retreat is the conclusion. The story is everything that made it the rational decision. Because when the commanders of $40 billion of American naval power make the rational decision to leave, you are not watching a tactical adjustment. You are watching the moment when 30 years of strategic assumptions collide with operational reality, and the assumptions lose. Let me tell you what those assumptions were, why they failed, and what replaced them last night. Because the coalition that executed what I watched on those satellite feeds did not build its capability overnight. It built it quietly, deliberately, over years, while Washington was busy congratulating itself on how effectively its pressure campaigns were keeping three nations divided, weak, and incapable of exactly what they just demonstrated they were capable of doing. That is not a military failure. That is the most consequential intelligence failure since Pearl Harbor. The scale of what was executed last night requires a specific kind of analytical honesty to describe accurately. And I'm going to provide that honesty because the media framing around this event is already constructing a narrative that is specifically designed to prevent you from understanding what actually happened. This was not a large Iranian missile barrage that got lucky. This was not opportunistic coordination between states with aligned interests. This was a fully synchronized multinational military operation with a level of technical integration, operational security, and execution discipline that I have genuinely never encountered in any intelligence assessment, any operational briefing, or any historical study of coordinated military action in the post-Cold War period. Three nations, three separate command architectures, separated by thousands of miles, operating simultaneously against a single target set with the seamlessness of a force that has been training and rehearsing this specific operation for years. When I say I did not believe they were capable of this, I am not hedging. I am telling you that the classified picture I had access to during my years in military intelligence did not adequately model what last night demonstrated was possible. And that gap between what the intelligence community believed about this coalition and what the coalition actually delivered is the most important analytical fact about the current global strategic environment. Now, let me walk you through what actually happened operationally, because the mechanics of this strike are where the story of American strategic failure is written in the most precise and unambiguous terms. Iran was the kinetic core, approximately 650 missiles. But here's the first thing the headline writers will get completely wrong. The number is the least important part of the Iranian contribution. The number gets cited because numbers are easy to communicate and because the scale creates emotional impact. What the number obscures is the architecture, and the architecture is everything. What matters is the architecture of the salvo. This was not 650 identical missiles fired in a single wave at a uniform altitude on a predictable flight profile, which is exactly the scenario that Iron Dome, David's Sling, and the Arrow batteries were optimized to handle. What Iran sent was a deliberately engineered mixture. The first layer was precision ballistic missiles aimed at command and control nodes, air defense headquarters, intelligence facilities, and the installations that make the entire defensive network function as a coherent system rather than a collection of isolated batteries. These were not fired to probe the defenses. They were fired to begin dismantling the brain of the defensive network from the first seconds of the attack. The second layer was low-flying cruise missiles on terrain-hugging trajectories that dropped below radar coverage and threaded through the sensor gaps that every fixed defense installation has when you know where to look. And Iran has known where those gaps are for a very long time. The third layer was timed deliberately for the end of the engagement window, not the beginning. Jet-powered loitering munitions launched so that they arrived when the interceptor batteries had already expended significant portions of their magazines, dealing with the ballistic and cruise missile waves. You do not overwhelm an interceptor battery by sending everything at once. You overwhelm it by managing the timing so that the last wave arrives when the magazines are running low, the operators are exhausted, and the system has already been degraded by everything that came before it. That is not improvisation. That is doctrine. Iran did not empty its magazine. What was launched last night represented a calculated portion of Iranian offensive capability, devastating enough to accomplish the mission objectives when integrated with what Russia and China contributed, but calibrated to leave a massive strategic reserve untouched. Last night was not Iran's final card. Last night was Iran demonstrating for the first time at full operational scale what the opening move looks like when the full architecture of the coalition is activated. Now, let me describe the Russian contribution, because this is the dimension that the Western press is most systematically undervaluing, and it is the dimension that transformed a large missile barrage into something the most sophisticated air defense network in the Middle East could not stop. Russia did not primarily contribute missiles, though it contributed approximately 200 precision strike rounds aimed specifically at the most heavily defended, highest priority targets in the theater. Different airframes, different speeds, different terminal approach profiles, different radar cross-sections than the Iranian weapons the defense algorithms had been trained and optimized to track. The systems defending those targets were not designed to simultaneously manage Iranian ballistic missiles, Iranian cruise missiles, Iranian loitering munitions, and Russian precision weapons arriving in overlapping waves with different performance envelopes. No system can be optimized for every possible threat profile simultaneously. You make choices, you prioritize, you build around the most likely threat. Last night, the attackers deliberately presented a threat that fell outside every optimization the defense architects had made. But the Russian contribution that actually decided the outcome was not the missiles. It was the electronic warfare. Russian jamming platforms had moved into Syria in the weeks preceding the strike under the cover of what was officially described as routine logistics activity. They activated approximately 18 minutes before the first Iranian missile crossed into Israeli airspace. 18 minutes. That number was chosen with operational precision, long enough to fully blind the early warning radars and battle management systems that coordinate the entire layered defense network. The systems that tell Iron Dome where to point. The systems that tell David's Sling when to fire. The systems that feed the aero batteries their targeting solutions. Without those systems operating at full capacity, the individual batteries were not blind, but they were operating in isolation, unable to coordinate, unable to prioritize, unable to manage their magazines intelligently against a complex incoming threat. 18 minutes is also short enough that the initial alerts in American and Israeli intelligence networks registered as what analysts call a routine electronic probe, the kind of jamming activity that happens regularly in that theater and almost never precedes a major strike. It was designed to be classified as background noise until it was too late to matter. That is not electronic warfare as a blunt instrument. That is electronic warfare as a precision scalpel. And now I need to tell you what China contributed, because this is the part that changes everything about how you should understand the next decade of global military competition. And it is the part the mainstream press is least equipped to explain honestly. China did not fire a single missile. China did not position a single soldier within 1,000 miles of the target area. China did not cross any legal threshold that could be characterized under serious reading of international law as a direct act of war. And China's contribution may have been the most decisive of the three, because what China provided was the nervous system, the operational brain, the intelligence and navigation backbone that tied the Iranian strike package and the Russian electronic warfare umbrella into a single seamlessly functioning weapon system. Without China's contribution, last night was a large and painful Iranian missile barrage with Russian jamming support. With China's contribution, last night was something that has never previously existed. A fully integrated multinational precision strike system operated simultaneously by three sovereign nations against a single target set. The Beidou satellite navigation system, China's GPS-independent global navigation network, provided precision guidance for every missile in the Iranian and Russian salvo, every single one. I want you to understand the engineering significance of what I just said. Beidou is not a backup to GPS. It is an independent system with global coverage, maintained and operated entirely outside American technical reach, whose frequency architecture is completely separate from the GPS spectrum that American electronic warfare assets are designed to jam. American electronic warfare assets were running at full power throughout the attack, jamming GPS signals across the entire operational area. Under normal circumstances, that jamming would have significantly degraded the accuracy of precision-guided weapons relying on GPS for terminal navigation. It is a standard American technique, and it is highly effective. Against weapons guided by Beidou, it had zero effect. The jammers were transmitting into frequencies the missiles were not using. That single technical detail, the shift from GPS to Beidou guidance, may be the most important military development of the last 20 years. Because it means that one of America's most reliable tools for degrading the effectiveness of adversary precision strike has been rendered operationally irrelevant against any actor using Chinese navigation infrastructure. That is not a marginal capability shift. That is a fundamental change in the offense-defense balance that the entire architecture of American electronic warfare was not designed to address. In the weeks before the strike, Chinese reconnaissance satellite orbital parameters were quietly adjusted in ways that are visible in tracking data, but that generate no public alarm because orbital adjustments happen routinely for dozens of technical reasons. What those adjusted orbits provided was persistent real-time overhead coverage of every high-value target in the strike package right up to the moment of launch, feeding continuously updated targeting data into Iranian guidance systems so that the coordinates being used were current to within minutes of launch. And throughout the strike, from the first electronic pulse to the final detonations, Chinese signals intelligence assets provided real-time battle damage assessment back to the operational commanders, telling them in near real time which targets had been successfully engaged, which required follow-on strikes, and which could be hit more effectively with a modified approach in a subsequent wave. That feedback loop, the ability to assess, adapt, and redirect during an ongoing strike operation, is something that historically, only the United States military has been able to do at this level of sophistication. Last night, a coalition that American policy was specifically designed to prevent from forming demonstrated they have built it independently in combat against one of the most heavily defended target sets on the planet. Now let me return to the carriers because the retreat of the Eisenhower and the Ford is the operational signature of everything I have just described, and it deserves to be understood on those terms rather than on the terms the official communication apparatus will use to explain it. The commanders of those carrier groups faced a threat environment that force protection doctrine could not accommodate while keeping irreplaceable capital ships at risk. The Russian jamming systems that were blinding Israeli defenses were simultaneously degrading the situational awareness picture for the American carrier groups, the sensor picture that tells a strike group commander what is in the water around him, what is in the air above him, and what threats are incoming from where. In a saturated missile environment with degraded sensors, you do not keep $40 billion ships within range. The loss of even one carrier would be a strategic catastrophe, not primarily because of the platform itself, but because of what it would mean for American deterrence credibility globally and for the domestic political consequences of losing a nuclear-powered supercarrier in a regional conflict. The commanders made the rational decision. The catastrophe is that the situation ever became one where that was the rational decision. And here is the question that every serious analyst needs to sit with. How did we arrive at a moment where the centerpiece of American power projection in the region retreats without engagement from a strike it did not intercept executed by a coalition it did not adequately model. The answer is not comfortable for the people who built American foreign policy across the last 3 decades. And I want to be direct about what that answer actually is, because the analysis that produced the strategic surprise of last night did not fail, because the intelligence community lacked access to information. It failed because the information that was available was not being assessed honestly. When you spend 30 years building a strategic framework on the premise that maximum pressure, sanctions, and diplomatic isolation will keep three major powers divided and incapable of meaningful military cooperation, you develop a powerful institutional investment in that premise being correct. Analysts who challenge the premise face career consequences. The assessment that questions the framework does not get elevated to the level where it can change policy. It gets filed, noted, and quietly set aside by people whose professional advancement depends on the framework remaining intact. Assessments that contradict it get filtered through review processes staffed by people whose professional identity is tied to the framework the assessment is challenging. The result is a progressive divergence between what is actually happening in the world and what official Washington believes is happening, with each year making the divergence wider and the eventual collision more severe. I watched this process from the inside. I watched assessments shaped to match what decision makers wanted to hear. I watched data that complicated the established narrative get classified as anomalous rather than as evidence requiring a fundamental reassessment. I watched the gap between the institutional model and the operational reality grow wider year by year, while the confidence with which the institutional model was articulated grew louder rather than quieter. Last night was what happens when that gap closes all at once. Three nations that American policy designated as isolated, weakened, and strategically constrained demonstrated in a single operational window that they have built joint military capability more sophisticated than anything the American intelligence community's public assessments attributed to them. They built it under sanctions. They built it under diplomatic isolation. They built it while being told by the most powerful government on earth that they were too weak and too divided to build it. And they activated it with the operational security discipline to ensure that when it went live, the target had no time to respond effectively. The carrier retreat is the strategic verdict on 30 years of American foreign policy in the most unambiguous form that military events ever produce. You can argue about diplomatic outcomes. You can argue about economic pressure results. You cannot argue about $40 billion of naval power making a rational decision to leave. That decision was not made because the commanders lacked courage. It was made because the strategic environment that American policy was supposed to prevent had materialized in a form that left rational military commanders with no viable alternative. The 30 years are over. The strategic order they were designed to maintain is gone. Not weakened, not challenged. Gone in the specific sense that the operational assumptions on which it rested have been publicly and empirically demolished in a single night by the actors the order was specifically constructed to contain. And the question that now faces every government in the world that has structured its security around American guarantees is the same question that was being asked aboard those carriers last night as they turned west. What does American deterrence actually mean when the deterrent withdraws?